Good evening. I'm John Batchelor. This is the John Batchelor Show. Much ahead about the trouble, very bad trouble, in the Middle East. The attack at Damascus twice over the weekend by the IAF, striking long-range, sophisticated ground-to-ground missiles from Iran being sent into the hands of Hezbollah, if not already there. Deep bunkers outside of Damascus, secondary explosions. That is the center of a much larger and much darker story. All the great powers involved in this one. The Secretary of State headed to Moscow to meet with Mr. Putin. They're not talking about energy. They're talking about the imminent crisis in the Middle East. The Syrian civil war can get much worse. However, we return now to the United States, where our challenge is policy. There is a kind of conflict going on in Washington now. It's hard to see because there's no voting, but it's about immigration. It's about immigration reform. The 11 or 12 or 13 million people in the United States not documented. The border security, the two parties, and the maneuvering for the 14 election and 16 election. A major candidate for the Republican Party is Marco Rubio, the young, spontaneous, and charismatic Cuban origin senator from Florida, a red state if you can keep it. And right now, David Drucker is reporting that the American Action Network is making a large pro-immigration ad buy. The significance here is that this is a GOP group. David, good evening to you. Taegan, Goddard, and John Avlon are with us as well, and I'd like them to comment. But first, David, the facts. The people buying this, supporting immigration, is this fresh? Have we heard from them before? Do we know where their money is coming from? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John. And look, this is a group that spent some millions of dollars in the last election cycle trying to elect and hold Republican House seats. So this group's no stranger to Republican politics, at least in the past couple of years. And they also take on policy fights here and there, and immigration reform is one of them. And, you know, one of the things that conservatives and Republicans that favor immigration reform learned from the last failed effort is that if you don't fight for this, the voices that are going to object on the grounds of amnesty, and that's the key word that they'll use to object, it makes it easier for those guys to win. It makes it possible for them to win. And so what they're trying to do this time around, the pro-immigration forces on the right, is make their case. And because Marco Rubio is at the center of this and supports it, they have a really strong figure to use who carries some credibility in the conservative movement.
Taegan Goddard of Political Wire is here. Taegan, we get immediately into the intramural contest. Everybody, I hope you enjoy policy because this is process of policy. The Heritage Foundation, almost simultaneously, publishes a study, long awaited, that is highly critical of immigration reform as it is now being talked about by Marco Rubio and the Gang of Eight, hanging a $6.3 trillion, that's T, trillion cost on the immigration. At the same time, the Cato Institute, immigration policy analyst, pushes back very hard. So far, comes the quote from Cato, this heritage study is as flawed and error-prone as the 2007 version. I read from David Drucker's Gopper's column. Right now, Taegan, watching this from Political Wire, this firefight that's breaking out in the Republican Party, are you surprised that Heritage is taking so many hits in the first hours? Good evening to you, Taegan.
Oh, not at all, John. Good evening. This is a battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party. I mean, there was a study out last week that suggested that Mitt Romney's presidential campaign would have needed to win 74% of the Latino vote in this country to have a chance at winning that election. This is a major problem for Republicans, and if the Latino vote goes the way of the African-American vote, moving on into the future, Republicans will not hold the White House for a generation or more. I mean, it's that simple, assuming obviously other things stay
right,
equal.
Right.
So this is a battle for the heart and soul of the Republican Party, and the fact that Paul Ryan came out today, also critical of the Heritage Foundation study, I think is fairly significant. Ryan is someone who's tried to steer his party, tried to steer the House Republican caucus back towards sanity, so to speak. make, and he recognizes that his party and his own political future may be tied to this bill.
Mr. Avlon, a very good evening to you. Thank you. And John is recently elevated to Generalissimo in the field, a political director of the Daily Beast and Newsweek. And Mr. Avlon, I ask you, as the same sort of Republican I am, wandering around in the field, being treated like lambs most of the time, are you surprised, Mr. Avlon, that the Republican Party has the strength to stand up and push back at heritage? After all, we've been battered these last years by the finger wagging from the right-wing think tanks.
Good evening, John. No, I'm not. And I do actually think this fight is clarifying. But I don't think the folks at Heritage and the Ted Cruz's versus the Marco Rubios are in an especially strong position, because I think whether it's simply a matter of pragmatism, being able to sort of understand the demographics or destiny, that a lot of folks with strong conservative credentials like Paul Ryan recognize that moving this bill forward is important, and simply replaying 2007 when George W. Bush tried to pass immigration reform with John McCain and Ted Kennedy and got thrashed by the far right and the talk radio crowd, that replaying that would be politically disastrous. It would also be disastrous in terms of policy and finally for the economy. So while I do think you're seeing fault lines erupt, you're seeing a very clear division in the Republican Party emerge on this issue, because so many folks on the center right, from Lindsey Graham to Marco Rubio to Paul Ryan, are saying this bill is important to the future of the country and the Republican Party. Those folks who are trying to scuttle it, that itself is clarifying. And for a long time, frankly, we've seen a trend of think tanks operating not as actual think tanks in the sense of proposing policy ideas, but for being cheerleaders and adjuncts to factions of the Republican Party. And that's what we're seeing with this study.
Mr. Drucker, do you sense that the Heritage report was anticipated by what we're seeing now, a coordinated effort, or is this spontaneous coherence breaking out in my Republican Party?
No spontaneity here, John. About a month ago, I first reported that the Cato Institute, which is libertarian-leaning but often aligned with conservatives, and other conservatives, including Grover Norquist and Americans for Tax Reform, were very concerned that the Heritage Foundation was going to release a study similar to its 2007 study. They were concerned because that study at the time caught a lot of Republicans by surprise that wanted immigration reform, and for those Republican lawmakers on the Hill that were interested in supporting it, the projected cost of immigration reform in the 2007 study scared them off the fence and running for the hills, and immigration reform was dead. And they anticipated this with the new study. So they started working early, and they were very public about this to try and discredit the Heritage study that they saw coming. They did such a good job that Jim DeMint in recent weeks both spoke and wrote on the Heritage blog that he has, defending Robert Rector, the chief author of the study, saying that they follow the methodology put out by the National Academy of Sciences, and they worked hard to push back against this. And so what you heard today from Paul Ryan, from ATR, Grover Norquist, etc., was something they had been talking about. And of course, on a policy note here, their chief bit of criticism, and this is a very conservative capital C criticism from a policy point of view, is that in their view, the Heritage Foundation study does not use dynamic scoring that Republicans are often criticized for using when it comes to things like comprehensive tax reform. The Heritage Foundation study doesn't do that at all. And so these Republicans, whatever else you think of this study, these conservatives are being very consistent in policy terms, in terms of their criticism of the Heritage study.
Taegan, the Democrats, especially the vice president, I saw a remark on your site. The vice president wants to go back to gun control. I understand that, the disappointment with the Joe Manchin, Pat Toomey vote. But he wants to get immigration done first. Is the White House ready to lend a hand to helping the Republicans push back against Heritage and the naysayers in the party that can wreck things? Are they going to join with Mr. Rubio and these other organizations and Mr. Ryan to get immigration done?
It's a fantastic question, John, but it's one that obviously the White House needs to tread delicately. Anytime it seems that the White House backs any proposal, it seems doomed in the eyes of the Republican caucus. So it would certainly be one. Obviously, the White House sees immigration reform as their better hope, even though there are some indications tonight that on the gun control bill, on the background check bill, that some Democrats and Republicans believe that there are more votes than there were when they took that vote. The White House sees immigration reform as having much greater chance. Interestingly, however, they also have to look at what Marco Rubio has said over the weekend. One of the co-sponsors, one of the co-authors of the Senate bill, has essentially said that he doesn't believe that it could pass the House, and that he thinks it might not pass the Senate as well. And so already, even though he authored this bill, already he's suggesting changes. He's trying to read the tea leaves in the Republican caucus in the Senate and try to figure out what's happening. And he's even beginning to think that this bill needs to be modified. So it's going to be a messy process over the course of the coming weeks, but fascinating to watch.
Taegan, Goddard of Political Wire, David Drucker of Goppers, he writes at Roll Call, and John Avlon of NewsBeast, that's Newsweek and the Daily Beast. And when we come back, Mr. Avlon, our tout, is going to look at the Sanford race in South Carolina against Colbert Bush within hours. A toss-up right now, but Avlon knows everything. I'm John Batchelor.